Welcome to tonight's special 4th of July edition of The Last Word. I'm Lawrence O'Donnell. When the president flamboyantly signed a so-called executive order to reverse his policy of separating parents and children at the southern border, much of the news media reported it wrongly as a rare reversal for Donald Trump, the tough guy who never backs down, surprisingly backed down. That's what some people thought. But the truth is, backing down is what Donald Trump does. We can list many more examples of Donald Trump backing down than Donald Trump holding to a consistent position. He said he would never settle the Trump University fraud case, and then he backed down and settled that case, paying $25 million for the fraud that he committed against Trump University students. He said he would get Mexico to pay for the wall on the southern border, and then immediately and famously backed down when the Mexican president said he wouldn't pay for the wall. Donald Trump said he would provide universal health care coverage to everyone in America. And then he backed down when Republicans in Congress refused to do that. He said he would not cut taxes on the rich. He even said he might raise taxes on the rich, and then he backed down and did a massive tax cut for the rich when Republicans in Congress told him that that's what they were going to do. He said he would eliminate the carried interest provision in the tax code that gives Wall Street bankers a lower income tax bracket than some of their assistants. And he said that he hated that tax loophole. And then he backed down when Republicans in Congress told him that they loved that tax loophole. As a candidate, he promised to reduce the deficit and the national debt, promised to eliminate the national debt. And now, as president, he backed down against fighting the debt and has allowed the Republican Congress to dramatically increase the deficit and the national debt. During the presidential campaign, Donald Trump opposed the only Republican idea for reducing the deficit and debt, and that is cutting Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And now, as president, Donald Trump has backed down against Republicans in Congress on that and is working with Republicans in Congress on new legislation to cut Medicare and Medicaid. So Social Security cuts surely will be on the way. You see, Donald Trump doesn't just back down more than any other president. He backs down faster than any other president. Donald Trump told Republicans in Congress that he supports the so-called immigration compromise bill between the extremist wing of congressional Republicans and the slightly less extremist wing of congressional Republicans. Remember that the so-called compromise bill was not a compromise between Republicans and Democrats. It was a compromise between Republicans and Republicans. And Donald Trump backed down and changed positions 3 times on that one bill, which is to say he backed down 3 times on that bill before it failed in the House. How is that for backing down? We have never seen anything like it. Donald Trump is the weakest president we have ever seen because no president has ever backed down as often or as fast or as completely and weakly as Donald Trump. Joining our discussion now, Jeff Sparrow, senior editor for Business Insider and an MSNBC contributor, and Jason Johnson, politics editor at TheRoot.com and an MSNBC contributor. And Jason, I always defer to the PhDs on the set, political science PhD. Hard to think of anyone who's backed down more than Donald Trump and more quickly than Donald Trump.
It's not surprising, though. I mean, you read David K. Johnson's written about this. People who write about Trump's biography, they talk about The Apprentice, and they say the irony of that show was about him telling people you're fired, when that's actually not how he operates. Mm-hmm. He's always avoided confrontation. He puts it off on other people. And with foreign leaders, we've seen it. You know, he talked to Pena Nieto. He backed down about the wall. He said, I'm going to talk to Kim Jong-un and we will get denuclearization. Nothing happened. He writes a sort of silly memo afterwards. So this is a president incapable of backing up his boasts, and I'm not surprised. And there will be very little that anyone can trust him on going forward because he never follows through.
Josh, it seems like not just Trump supporters, but a lot of the media falls for the pose of Donald Trump, the tough guy.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to his career in real estate. I mean, Donald Trump would announce all sorts of grand projects that wouldn't end up getting built. He was supposed to build the tallest building in the world on the west side of Manhattan in the late 1980s. He's been talking for 30 years about building a Trump Tower in Moscow. It's in The Art of the Deal. In 1986, he's writing about how he's about to embark on a partnership with the Soviets to build a Trump Tower in Moscow. So he would announce these grand things and then not do them, and it would just sort of be forgotten. It was on to the next thing. And I think we've seen that in the presidency, although I don't think we've seen it everywhere. I think there are certain things where he is surprisingly stuck to what he was intending to do. The biggest surprise of those for me is in trade policy and tariffs, where this is the one area where he really has broken with his own party, upset people in Congress, and has continued pushing harder on that policy. When he initially announced these tariffs on steel and aluminum, there were these big exceptions for the European Union and Canada and Mexico, and I sort of had your analysis. Oh, he backed down on this. He announced these big tariffs, and he put so many exceptions in them that they don't matter. Well, he allowed those exceptions to lapse, and now those tariffs really matter, and they're really shaking up our economic policy. And so that's one area where he hasn't backed down. So I think, he does have a tendency to do this, but sometimes he doesn't, and sometimes it's quite consequential when he sticks with something surprising.
And Jason, the thing about the tariffs is that it is one of the single stupidest areas of Trump thinking, which has already backfired on him in many ways that are surprising him, that he never saw coming. But the other thing about it is it opened up a giant lobbying business in Washington, which is getting exceptions to these tariffs. And that's another Trump area where he completely not only backed down to the so-called swamp in Washington, the lobbying swamp, he has made it swampier than ever.
It is a soup now. He leaves footprints wherever he goes. There's so much of a swamp. I mean, it's not just that he's opened it up for lobbying, but many of the people he's brought in, right? Didn't he promise us that he was going to bring in the best people? They were going to clean up and make government more efficient. And yet we've had constant turnover, constant examples of people that he's had to fire, that he can't fire. And again, it goes back to his inability to follow through with his boast. Even Omarosa, remember, he couldn't fire her herself. He sent somebody else to go do it. So even when he has people where he says, hey, they're the best folks and maybe they're not working out anymore, the president has not shown an ability to sort of take control of the own Washington, D.C. that he had been complaining about for 18 months when he ran for office.
Let's listen to him, because it's worth hearing him actually say some of these things again. Let's listen to him talking about raising taxes.
Do you believe in raising taxes on the wealthy?
I do, including myself.
And Josh, he backed down to congressional Republicans and to his family probably, and gave himself and his family the biggest tax cut in history.
I think one question is it really backing down if you never really meant it in the first place?
That's a whole paradigm shift to this conversation. Go ahead, start.
And I think there's two categories of these things. I mean, there's stuff like the original travel ban, which was significantly more sweeping than the one that ultimately ended up getting upheld by the Supreme Court, where the lawyers sort of came to him and said, this isn't going to fly, you got to change this. And that's, he really wanted the more sweeping one. He backed down in the face of opposition and outrage and judicial smackdowns, and ended up with something that was more limited. On the other hand, with the taxes, I think he was just making stuff up and saying, oh, it sounds good if I say I'm going to raise taxes on myself. So I don't know that I'd call that a back down, because I think that the tax bill that he ended up signing was probably pretty close to what he wanted. It was an enormous corporate tax cut, allowed him to go around and brag about how much he cut taxes on business, and it was a big individual income tax cut that was good for him and all of his rich friends.
So historians, Jason, are going to have that asterisk on the backing down column. We believe he never meant this one. But you can see the dynamics of that, though, because here's the Republican running for president saying, yeah, I'm thinking about raising taxes, including on myself. And what that works for in Trump imagery is boldness. It's a bold statement that no other Republican would make. And then it turns out, of course, he absolutely never meant it.
He never meant it. He was never going to follow through with it. And you remember what he said during the week with Kim Jong-un when he was negotiating? He's like, well, if I'm wrong, I'll just make up something, next year when I have.
He'll never admit it.
I'll never admit it. So, the president has always made it clear. I have always believed that the only thing you can really trust about Donald Trump is his mind is changed by the last person he talked to in the room. I don't even think he's always aware when he's lying. I think, remember, we saw the video during Parkland, right? And he's sitting there and he's like, yeah, we really ought to do something about guns. And the Democrats are like, wait a minute, this guy just told us yesterday that he wasn't in favor of this. The president changes his mind constantly. And because he can't be trusted, he is either sometimes backing down, sometimes lying, or sometimes, I think, just shooting from the hip. And unfortunately, everybody else has to juggle whenever he's spilling.
Well, we saw those two White House meetings, one on immigration policy, where Dianne Feinstein made a reasonable presentation to him about, let's do the DACA kids. And the president said to her right in that moment, okay, let's go do that. And then we actually saw the physicality of him backing down with McCarthy, California Republican from the House at that table, almost putting his hands on him to pull him back into the Republican spot where he eventually got. And then we saw the same thing on that guns meeting in the White House where basically the same thing happened. He started agreeing with Dianne Feinstein and gun restriction advocates before Republicans had to almost physically pull him back.
Yeah, I think sometimes when what we're hearing out of the president is a recapitulation of what he's hearing from other people. Sometimes this is Republicans and Democrats in Congress. Sometimes it's warring factions within his own White House. So I don't think the president ever had any intention of raising taxes on the rich. I do think Steve Bannon had an idea that he actually wanted to do about a new high tax bracket on very high incomes. His idea was, well, this mostly hits some corporate CEOs and some sports stars and Hollywood celebrities who don't like us anyway. It's not a capital tax. So I think Bannon had that idea and was interested in it. I don't think the president was ever seriously going to do it, but maybe if he'd just been talking with Bannon, he would talk about that. Similarly, all of his flip-flops on China, where he's soft one day and hard the next, is that him backing down, or is that one day he's been talking with his trade advisor, Peter Navarro, who's a hardliner on China? The next day he's been talking with the Treasury Secretary, who wants to take a much softer line on China. So I think you see him bouncing around like this, and it's a reflection of who's up and who's down in the administration today.
The most powerful thing, the most powerful power that a president actually has is persuasion, right? History, that's really all they can do is persuade. When you back down consistently, when you cannot be trusted, you are a powerless president. You cannot persuade anyone if they don't believe you're going to follow through.
And Josh, the big fear people have about the backing down, and this is across party fears, is when you put him alone in a room with someone like Vladimir Putin.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that's the big fear about the Kim Jong-un summit, too, that, that there were things that the North Koreans wanted, and you see it even in the language, where we are not talking about our exercises with the South Koreans as exercises anymore, but as war games. You have the president conceding the idea that they are provocative when we do that. And so adopting the North Korean language, nodding to the idea that we might want to take our troops off the Korean peninsula, these are concessions that the president is making without even realizing that he is making them because he gets in that room and he's a weak negotiator.
The back down Trump policy. Jason Johnson, Josh Barro, thank you both for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up, Tom Arnold is going to join us once again. The last time he was here, he told us about his chats with former Trump personal lawyer Michael Cohen. Tonight, he'll talk about what happened to Roseanne, his former wife and former castmate on The Roseanne Show, how Roseanne went from the former liberal he knew and loved to a Trump supporter. And later, Professor Michael Eric Dyson is here to tell us what truth sounds like, which happens to be the title of his important new book. And I'll be discussing my book, Deadly Force, with Joy Reid. Stay with us. Recently, Tom Arnold was in New York City, staying in the same hotel where former Trump personal attorney Michael Cohen has been staying. And Tom Arnold said he had some conversations with Michael Cohen, which Tom Arnold suggested were much more in-depth conversations than Michael Cohen was willing to admit to. Michael Cohen went on Twitter to say he just ran into Tom Arnold in the hotel lobby, so he wasn't really hanging around with an avowed Trump enemy like Tom Arnold. Tom Arnold has a new show coming out in September on Viceland in which he promises to reveal everything he knows about Michael Cohen. On this program, after talking to Tom Arnold about Michael Cohen a couple of weeks ago, he stayed with us for a discussion about what happened to his former wife and former castmate, Roseanne. How did Roseanne go from the liberal who Tom Arnold was married to the woman whose racist tweet about Obama advisor Valerie Jarrett got her fired and got her show canceled by ABC? So I had Roseanne on the show several years ago. She was a liberal, kind of extreme, on the extreme left, as we would call it, a Green Party candidate, I think. I can't quite remember. For president, she was thinking about. I would once in a while run into her at a restaurant here or there in LA, and she was extremely pleasant, and it sounded like, she had seen my show. This is years ago. I haven't run into her in the last, 3 or 4 years. What happened?
I honestly, we got divorced 24 years ago, and it seems like yesterday. But no, I have no idea. I mean, I have seen her. I did her roast a few years ago, where nobody else would do it. That's what she called me to John Goodman and Lori. Nobody showed up, and so the last minute, she asked me to do it, and it was great. It was great, and we had a moment, and I was like, I got to get the heck out of here. It ended well, and so I didn't know. As the show got ready to come back, I was like, that'll be fantastic. And then I have my own show about Trump, kind of anti-Trump. And so I did a kind of a deep dive into what she was up to on the internet. And I was shocked how not just right wing, but just crazy.
Yeah, I mean, I know people and have known them all my life where and they present fairly well publicly.
Right.
But if they, at some point tweeted something that was borderline racist or well over the line racist, I would see it and go, I know where that came from.
Right.
I know what part of that person that came from. Do you know what part of that person that tweet came from that ruined her career?
When I met Roseanne, I worked at a meatpacking plant in Iowa for 3 years, and I'm 7 years younger than her, and I was a new comic, and I'd never met anybody like her. I came from from Tubbo, Iowa, like a working class town, and she was so liberal and a feminist and a mother, and I had never met anybody. Like, I never heard her say anything racist. People of color, I never heard that term. Trust me, my next door neighbor's dog was named the N-word. Yeah. And that's where I grew up. And so I was never, like you said, you could see some people, or people in my family, they tweeted something racist. I go, yeah, I get that. So it's shocking. It is shocking that her mind is, first of all, is Donald Trump. We met him 30 years ago. We did a special over at Trump Castle, and she was like, this guy is whatever, and she didn't dig that, and then to be all in on him, and then to toward her mind to get this race. I mean, it is so crazy. And it's not just a tweet, as you know. She's just a part of that and accepting that. And a lot of people are. I mean, it's a full-on subculture.
Now, Bill Maher, who still says he's a friend of hers, which I understand, even friends in great trouble, and I understand that. Bill Maher seems to assign it, when you listen to his public comments, to she has mental health issues, and she has prescriptions for that and meds for that, and Bill seems to talk about her, I don't think I'm putting words in his mouth, it's what I've heard him say publicly, as somebody who has some mental health issues and got in trouble because of that.
Well, I don't know what Bill knows. When we lived together, first of all, she was there supportive for me. I went to rehab right before we got married. I'm an addict. I'm an alcoholic. And she supported me, and my stepkids went through it with me, and it was a wonderful thing for our family. And so I got out of there, and then we got married 2 days later. And then she had some mental health issues, which she was public about. She had multiple personality disorder, and she had 27 different personalities. Only 2 of them liked me, was my joke, but the other part's true. And so I spent a lot of time with her at Johns Hopkins University, supporting her as she has supported me, and that was a real deal. And she worked very hard and integrated those personalities, and we learned a lot about it. Came some perhaps from childhood trauma, sexual abuse, which we both dealt with, and very proud of her. And she was able to integrate that and be a powerful voice in that area. And by the end of the marriage, she'd done well with it, and our marriage was very chaotic and too much public, and we were both responsible for that, and we just wore out. But she seemed to be in a pretty good place, but what's happening now, I don't think I could attribute to that. There's a lot of anxiety in general in the public, and people are just like this, and the president just keeps pushing that button instead of saying, "Okay, America, calm down." He just keeps hitting that button like it's scary out there, and it's bad, and he keeps lying and lying, and people are just like this, and it's like if you're a kingpin, and that's the drug, it's that internet that keeps putting the fear, and he's pushing that thing, and that's what he does. So he's their kingpin for mental illness. If you got a little bit, you're in your house and you're on your computer, he's the guy that keeps pushing it, and he knows it, and he keeps doing that instead of making things better, because he thinks that's my base, that's my base. And she's definitely a part of that. I don't know if that's 100% why, but she is addicted to that, and there's millions of people that are.
Coming up, a discussion with Joy Reid about my book, Deadly Force, and the problems involving police use of deadly force, which I have been studying for decades now. That's next. Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Laquan McDonald, Stephon Clark. And now we add the name of 17-year-old Antwon Rose to the recent list of unarmed black men and boys killed by police. Antwon Rose was shot in Pittsburgh last month while unarmed and running away from a police officer and threatening no one. That shooting was captured on video. This is difficult to watch, and if you do watch it, you will see a 17-year-old boy posing no physical threat to anyone being shot in the back. Here is that video.
Why are they shooting at him? Get down, Shorty. No, I'm recording this.
I've been studying police use of deadly force since shortly after I graduated from college. I wrote a book about it called Deadly Force, which was published 35 years ago when no one outside of black communities cared about this subject. No one in the news media cared about this subject. The first article I ever wrote and published was an op-ed piece in the New York Times about police use of deadly force in 1979. And that was the New York Times' very first op-ed piece ever about police use of deadly force. That is how ignored this subject was then. On the weekend, after we first saw that video of Antwon Rose being shot and killed by police, I joined Joy Reid on her show to discuss deadly force.
With me to discuss, Lawrence O'Donnell, host of MSNBC's The Last Word and the author of Deadly Force, a police shooting and my family's search for the truth, which was recently republished in paperback with a new preface. First of all, congratulations on that, Lawrence.
Thank you very much.
I was bragging that I have an old school version of this book.
It's actually, the original is over 30 years old.
Yeah.
And one of the sad things to report is I've been on this subject for 35 years.
Yeah.
And the only thing that has changed is that we now have video like that.
And
that video didn't exist 35 years ago.
And why doesn't that video change the outcome in these cases?
It's going to have a very powerful effect on the outcome for a bunch of reasons. That's going to be the crucial piece of evidence for the district attorneys studying this already. After my book, this book first came out in 1983. Mm-hmm. The next year, the year after this book came out, the Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional to make it legal to shoot fleeing felony suspects, because a bunch of states at that time, not all of them, but a bunch of states had laws that specifically said it is legal to shoot a fleeing felony suspect. All they have to do is flee. And the Supreme Court said, no, that's an unconstitutional law. You can't do that. So now the justification for shooting has to be some kind of threat to someone. And by definition, unarmed fleeing suspects are not a threat to anyone. The police officers' stories always, in these cases, almost always, would carry this phrase: he turned in a threatening manner as if to shoot. I have seen that phrase, word for word, in countless police reports over decades. And without that video, he turned in a threatening manner as if to shoot would work as a complete defense. And it doesn't matter after the fact if it turns out he didn't have anything in his hand, or he had a phone in his hand, or he had a toy in his hand. But that video shows someone running away, being shot at while running away. The autopsy is going to come out. The autopsy very likely is going to show entrance wounds in the back. In the story in my book, the entrance wounds, when the autopsy comes out, are in the back and the back of the head and the back of the neck. And that kind of information is going to determine where this case goes. It's a very, very, it's not clear to me at this stage what the defense would be here. The police officer has been suspended, which is the correct action. If you had to bet at this point, this case is going to go against the police officer.
And it's interesting. You come from a family of lawyers. One of the great things about this book, you learn a lot more about you, Lawrence O'Donnell,
who is not a lawyer,
who I used to mistake for a lawyer.
I don't get personal publicly, but this book is the story of my family. It's the story of my father, who was a Boston cop, who became a lawyer, who took on one of these cases, fighting his own police department. Very dramatic story. We actually turned it into a TV movie on CBS in the 1980s. And it was the defining version of this story at the time, defining only in the sense that this was the one time that a lawyer went into court and proved that the police were lying and that this really was a police killing, and it was like a lightning strike, because it's not like people were successfully going into court after that and doing it again.
Yeah, I feel like this has parallels to the Walter Scott case, the way you're describing it. I want to read a little bit about the description here. This book is about what it was like before that fleeing felon rule, before we knew the names Michael Brown, Laquan McDonald, Stephen Clark, and others who have inspired protesters to chant Black Lives Matter. What's shocking is how little has changed except for the new public and political awareness that there's a problem. The Walter Scott case, which was, again, a man who was fleeing, had his back to the officer. It's one of the rare cases where you saw justice the case, and even that had a hung jury.
Yeah, but without video, there wouldn't have been a jury.
Right.
Without video, the story would have been he turned in a threatening manner as if to shoot, or there would have been a planted weapon of some kind, as there is in this story.
Which was tried with Walter Scott.
In this book, the police tried to plant a weapon at the scene. There were too many witnesses, so they couldn't plant the weapon right with the dead victim of this shooting. They had to plant it at some distance from him, and they were able to prove that that was a plant. But video changes everything, and video is the huge development, and that's why, the people who pull out their phones and capture those scenes are doing the most important investigative work that can be done in these cases, because the first thing it does is it limits the police ability to tell a story.
Yeah.
And let me just tell you, in the old days, 35 years ago, if there were guns in that car and the dead body was over there, the police would have taken the guns out of that car, put it in the hand of the dead victim, and there would have been no video of that. That video camera and the police awareness that there are these video cameras prevents them from doing some of these things. But what's true of it all, though, is the spirit of trying to get away with it once a mistake has been made is still there, and it controls virtually everything that the police do after the fact.
Why is it still so hard to convict police officers in cases where, to the layperson, it seems obvious, the Tamir Rice case comes to mind, that this was an unlawful a murder to a lot of people? Why is it so hard?
Yeah, there's a tremendous public bias in favor of police. It's a really hard thing to do. People believe that the job is much more dangerous than it is. The truth of the job is that most police officers in America in a 30-year career never hear the sound of gunfire.
Yep.
They never hear it.
Yep.
They never have to take out their guns.
Yep.
They never fire their guns.
Yep.
And so there's this exaggerated notion of how dangerous it is, and that creates an exaggerated sympathy for the story that the police officer is telling, and they are absolved in that process of having to explain each decision, right? So Michael Brown is shot several times. There's no explanation for the second bullet. Right? The first bullet is, I felt threatened. Okay, so you fired one. A police officer is supposed to evaluate after every shot what the police officer does next. You only fire the second, the third, the fourth, and the fifth for a specific reason to each one of those bullets. The juries are absolving them of that responsibility.
Yeah, absolutely. Lawrence O'Donnell, in my household, we are a 2 Lawrence O'Donnell book household. We have both of these.
The Complete Works.
We have The Complete Works, yes. Playing with Fire is a great book, too. But Deadly Force is now out in paperback. You should really check it out. It is a really terrific book.
Up next, Professor Michael Eric Dyson with an important lesson on what truth sounds like. And later, a brother and sister who survived the mass murder at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. David Hogg and his sister, Lauren Hogg, will join us. The Washington Post has been tracking the lies President Trump has told from day one of his presidency. It is now well over 3,000, and it's always at least hundreds of lies per month. Into that poisonous information atmosphere comes Professor Michael Eric Dyson with his important new book entitled What Truth Sounds Like. Michael, thank you very much for joining us to talk about the book. And I'm so fascinated by this. You're looking back over 50 years ago at 2 men who were trying to find their way to the truth, certainly all the time. And we're living in an age now where so many people have lost the ability to even know what truth sounds like. The president seems to be hoping to prevent people from remembering what truth sounds like.
That's exactly right. And the beauty of these two men is that they were able to bring all of their hurts, pains, their agonies, their histories, similar in some ways. Bobby Kennedy, known as the runt among the boys in the Kennedy clan, Jimmy Baldwin as a black gay man, struggling with what the identity that would propel him forward and that would allow him to become a spokesperson for his people. So Bobby Kennedy amplified the best liberal tendencies of the Northeast, and Jimmy Baldwin was coming in the heart of Harlem, trying to talk about the pace and the pain of black people and how we could grasp hold of a truth that was elusive. And that truth was black people are human beings. They should be treated with deep and profound respect, and that they offer something, a witness to the world of hurt and pain that others don't often look at. But if we listen to it, we could grow. And Bobby Kennedy was willing to do so. Now, he was first defensive to the truth that James Baldwin brought. And he had, of course, help with Harry Belafonte, Lena Horne, Kenneth Clark, and Lorraine Hansberry, who brought the full weight of their witness to him. But it was a young man named Jerome Smith, a Congress of Racial Equality activist, who, along with John Lewis, is the most noteworthy and storied freedom fighter of all, because it was beat to within an inch of his life so often. It was his witness at that meeting that pushed Bobby Kennedy into a kind of deep and profound introspection that very few had pushed him to. And beyond the defensiveness that he had first exhibited, he was able then to embrace the notion that we got to speak about race not in just political terms, but in moral terms. And that shaped the rest of his life from there on out.
And Michael, this meeting that you're talking about was arranged by Bobby Kennedy. He wanted to meet with these black Americans at a very dangerous point in the civil rights movement. People were risking their lives in the South. He's the Attorney General. It's 1963, I believe, when the meeting occurs in Manhattan at a very fancy Kennedy apartment in Manhattan. He's gathered all of these people, and it's someone who is there to try to learn. But as you say, the details I recall from the meeting, Bobby Kennedy had some very, very uncomfortable moments.
He really did. And to his credit, he stayed through them, though. Many people, when they get that kind of discomfort, they get up and leave. They walk away. They exit. They voice their disconcert, and then they leave. He was there. I'm uncomfortable, but I'm going to remain. Now, he was forced to confront some truths he didn't want to confront, but after he saw them, after he heard them, after he felt them in his gut, it was a real gut punch delivered by the people who were there that day. To his credit, he opened up. And the thing he was trying to solve in that meeting, Lawrence, was the rage that black people were feeling and their attraction to the black Muslims, and furthermore, how we could figure out a way to pacify alienated white voters and figure out a way to bring them back into the folds, ironically enough, at the expense of those black people who were loyal. That's not something that's dissimilar to what's going on now when we have a 2016 election where we were told that it was a referendum on the white working class, and that black women who voted in the 90% and black men in the 80s somehow had to defer to the interests of a white working class who had somehow become alienated. That was the same kind of dynamic going on then. But what Bobby Kennedy began to grasp hold of is that if we listen to these people, their hurt, pain, and agony, their suffering, but also the contributions that they might make. These are brave people in the face of tremendous odds who are transforming a nation with little material resource, but they have the greatest resource: moral authority, moral suasion. And Bobby Kennedy, beginning as not a henchman but a fearless advocate for McCarthy in the 50s, then evolved to his position of deep and profound empathy. And by the end of his life, he was known as one of, if not the most respected white men in black America.
And Michael, what I love about the story you're telling in this book and the scene you've set is in the timing of it in the early 1960s is the 1960s is a stunning decade of change, unlike anything we'd ever seen before. Change in everything, change in music, change in culture, change in consumption habits. Parents went at the beginning of the decade worrying that their kids might have too many beers on prom night. By the end of the decade, they're worried if they might try heroin. They're worried if they might get carried away with drugs. And there you capture these men in the kind of middle of the decade. They're all changing. Not one of them thinks the same thing in 1969 that he or she thought in 1961. And Bobby Kennedy is the white representative of watching that thinking change. There were segregationists in 1961 who were no longer segregationists in 1969. There was so much movement, so much development, so much changing of minds in that period of time.
That's extraordinarily well stated. And Jimmy Baldwin himself, when you think about his own evolution, he had just written that famous New Yorker story that became the second part of his famous The Fire Next Time. He had moved from writing introspectively and critically about the relationships between black and white people to a searing indictment of white innocence. He found his rhythm, so to speak. He found the power of his literary expression in the kind of anger and rage that was consuming so many segments of black America, but he transmuted it into something that was edifying, that was uplifting, and that others could take a look at and learn from. And so Bobby Kennedy was changing, he was transforming. Later on, of course, in the 70s, when he was able to lay claim fully and openly to his own black gay identity, that added yet another layer to the complicated and nuanced understanding of race and its interpenetration with gender and sexuality and class. And when you think about those people locked in battle, they were locked in essence with an idea that they grappled with. If Victor Hugo is right, nothing is more powerful than an ideal whose time has come. They were living in the midst of the opening of that. We talk about it now as being woke, but they were awake before woke was awake. And so what happened is that they began to give us the language for how do you deal with people you disagree with, but you can learn from, how you ultimately respect. Let's not forget, Bobby Kennedy was not a great fan of Martin Luther King Jr. He knew he had to work with him. So at that meeting, he wanted to talk to people who were not beholden to an organization or an affiliation with an institution, but who were free relatively to speak their minds, their hearts, and their souls. And even though he got more than he bargained for initially, he learned to hear it. And he did something that was extraordinary, that if this president ever did, it would be world-changing and transformational. He shut up and he listened. He didn't presume he knew the truth. He began to listen to people that he could learn from and that he could use not only as grist for his own intellectual and political mill, but as a way to transform the moral landscape of America. He was a true statesman, and he found his voice in that meeting. That meeting, though beginning in anger and resentment, ultimately led to powerful transformation and change for Bobby Kennedy and subsequently for the nation itself.
Michael Eric Dyson's new book is called What Truth Sounds Like, RFK, James Baldwin, in our unfinished conversation about race in America. Michael Eric Dyson, thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Always great to be here, Lawrence.
Coming up, David Hogg, who you have heard repeatedly on this program. He is one of the survivors of the mass murder at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. And he is one of the leaders of the student gun safety movement that was born after that shooting. His younger sister, Lauren Hogg, who also survived that school massacre, will also join us to discuss their new book, Never Again. The 4th of July is a day of family gatherings around America, which means it's all the more painful a day today in Parkland, Florida, where the families of the 17 people massacred by a mass murderer in Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School face their first 4th of July without the loved one they lost on that day. For many of the students who survived, it is the first 4th of July in their new lives as student activists trying to reduce gun violence. Joining us now, David Hogg and his sister Lauren Hogg. They are the authors of the book Never Again, A New Generation Draws the Line. David Hogg is, of course, the class of 2018, and Lauren is the class of 2021 at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. Thank you both very much for joining us. David, Lauren, how did this book come about?
Essentially by us putting all of our knowledge together that we could, trying to kind of therapeutically go through the past and help people understand the empathy of the situation and work together to help fix these problems.
And Lauren, so you were a freshman at the high school when the shooting happened. You'll be a sophomore next year. What what activated you public? What made you want to be public and join your brother in this publicly?
Yeah, what made me want to become public with this is every morning I wake up and I lost 4 friends that day, and I think of them. I think of the conversations we had, the things that we talked about doing, the colleges we wanted to attend, and the families we wanted to have. And I think I need to live for them. I need to fight for them. And I think of the people, the little kids I see in the airport that walk up to their parents, and I think I never want this to happen to them. And that's really what pushes me every day.
You say something that surprised me in the book. But you've gone through an experience that the rest of us haven't. And so, of course, it includes dynamics that we wouldn't anticipate. You say when you meet people, you hope that they don't say to you, "I'm sorry."
Mm-hmm. I mean, I say that in the book because, like I state, I've grown up in a time where I was born after Columbine. I was 9 years old when Sandy Hook happened, and I've seen people say sorry before. And I've seen nothing be done about it. We don't need sorry, we don't need apologies, we need action.
David, there's a quote in here that fascinates me too. When people have, and I've talked to you about this privately, and the issue of grieving, and because you went through this and then almost instantaneously were on TV as a reporter, literally. I mean, that day, telling us what had happened, and you've been so active in this. And so many of us have been concerned, you know, has David been able to grieve? And what you say in the book about it is this. You say, people keep telling me that I just haven't started grieving yet, but I don't want to grieve. I don't want to go through the 5 stages that end up at acceptance. Not now, not ever.
And I think that's the way it should be for America, too. We shouldn't accept that every day kids, just like you and I were in the past, and that just like people have across America and the world, are dying on our streets, and we just sit back and do nothing about it. And I hope that's what people take from this book. They understand the empathy of the situation, and that the people that are out there aren't just names on the TV. They're friends, they're family, and they're people that really, they're just loved in their community, and sadly, they're lost. And so many others are too. I just hope that people understand the gravity of the situation and don't say that they're sorry, but when you go up to somebody, if you know that they've been through something like this, just say you're there fighting for them alongside them and ask how you can help them in joining this battle. And
David, will you be of voting age for the next for the congressional election? You will be, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Lauren, you're a few years away from it, and so I know how, and I think everyone knows how David feels about elections and what they mean to this subject, the congressional elections in particular, in relation to supporting candidates who are not supported by the NRA. You live at a greater distance from having that moment of being able to go into a Florida voting booth, or perhaps wherever you're going to college, go into a voting booth. How do you feel that same kind of urgency about the election, even though you yourself can't vote?
Absolutely. I think about that all the time. I think about the fact that I still have 3 more years before I'm going to be able to vote. And I think I realize since this happened, my power, even though I can't vote, that I can have conversations with my parents and my family and my friends and talk about politics and inspire them to vote. And I think one of the most important things is talking to the people who don't agree with you. Because that's the only way anything has gotten done, is by talking to each other, not ignoring each other, not screaming at each other, but instead of having debates, having discussions and coming to a compromise.
You know, this reminds me of when I was in high school, and I too young to vote, but it was during the anti-Vietnam War protests. And high school kids like me were going to those protests, in my case, with my older brothers who could vote. And I got to say, even though I could not vote, I did not feel disconnected from the political process. David, what would you say to kids who are too young to vote, who just don't feel the connection to the political process?
I would say if you don't feel the connection and you kind of feel like it's just too boring, one thing that really got me involved, and I talk about this in the book too, is watching shows like John Oliver and Last Week Tonight and The Daily Show and things like that, that take a serious topic but also bring comedy into the situation to show you the ridiculousness of what's going on right now in American politics. And also go and work on campaigns and go and help people. That's where a lot of happiness in life is found. Is through helping people and asking how they can help them. And that's what we're doing this book too. Any of the money that we would be making from it is going to 2 places, taxes and charity. We're giving to Change the Ref, which is an organization started by Joaquin Oliver's dad. Joaquin died in the shooting. And we're giving to March for Our Lives and Chicago Strong, which is a coalition of charities on the south side of Chicago that's student-led and organized and founded that work to end gun violence there.
The book is Never Again. The authors are David Hogg, Lauren Hogg. Thank you both very much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We'll be right back. And that is our 4th of July Last Word. The Last Word is here weeknights at 10 Eastern Time. And you can always listen to The Last Word as a podcast. It's free on Apple Podcasts now or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey, it's Chris Hayes from MSNBC. You know, every day I come to the office and we make a television show. And every day I think to myself, there's so much more I want to talk about. And so this is our podcast. It's called Why Is This Happening? And the whole idea behind it is to get to the root of the things that we see play out every day. They're driven by big ideas. Each week, I sit down with a person uniquely suited to explain why this is happening.
New episodes of Why Is This Happening? Every Tuesday. Listen for free wherever you get your podcasts.